revolution in fundraising, and he talks about reward-based versus equity-based crowdfunding, and we can talk about that in more detail later. But basically, there are two different divisions in crowdfunding. One is reward-based and one is equity-based. And most people are probably familiar with reward-based crowdfunding. That's what I do. That's Kickstarter, especially if you're in the board game industry. If you're trying to get a reward for being part of a Kickstarter campaign or a crowdfunding campaign, you're part of reward-based crowdfunding. You're trying to get some kind of object in exchange for backing a campaign. Equity crowdfunding is different. Equity crowdfunding is where you are actually selling your company as part of your crowdfunding campaign. That's a way to do it. It's much more like raising capital through stock, selling stock or something like that. That's kind of the analogy. I've never done that. I don't have interest in doing that. That would be like if I wanted to sell, I could raise money through equity crowdfunding if I wanted to sell part of Infinite Black. That is something we could do, but it's not something I'm interested in. But what Peter Diamandis is going to do here is talk about a 1-2 punch that's going to occur with both reward and equity-based crowdfunding. So there are a couple of different things here. He talks about how to do reward-based crowdfunding, and he does say that reward-based crowdfunding is where you pre-sell a product or service, and he does put pre-sell in quotes there. But that's one thing I would start off kind of talking about, and I think I do want to talk about that in a whole nother video. It's what's the difference between a pre-sell or a pre-order and a crowdfunding campaign. I think there's a huge difference, and Jamie Stegmaier talks about this a lot. A lot of people in the crowdfunding community talk about the difference between pre-selling or pre-orders and crowdfunding. So he does use the term pre-sell. Maybe I think he's using it loosely here, so I don't want to stay on that too much. But he does say that, okay, reward-based crowdfunding is pre-selling, but so take that for what it's worth. And he talks about the first major crowdfunding success took place in May 2020 with the Pebble watch. And so if you've been following crowdfunding, especially in its early days, you probably know about the Pebble watch. And he says that one raised $10.2 million worth of that product in 31 days. And then 2 years later, the Coolest Cooler, that's one that everybody's followed as well. The Coolest Cooler took the lead by selling, he uses that word again, but I would say pledging for it. It was a Kickstarter campaign. There were however many backers came out and pledged $13.3 million to bring the Coolest Cooler to life. Now, if you watched my other videos, you know that the dollar figure raised on a Kickstarter campaign or any crowdfunding campaign is not does not indicate success. It's not something that indicates success directly. Big numbers get people's attention. That's why we talk about them. That's why it's up on the Kickstarter page. How much did this raise? How much have you raised crowdfunding? Okay, but none of that matters if you can't execute. So a big number does not mean that your product is going to be successful. It doesn't mean that your crowdfunding campaign has been successful, because you're not successful until you've been able to successfully deliver your rewards to your backers. And in this case, the examples that he gave here, and of course they didn't know this at the time because this article was written several years ago, but it's important to look back on these things. The Pebble watch and the Coolest Cooler were failures. They raised all of this money, but ultimately they were not successful businesses or successful in raising or successful in producing their products. And then he talks about that as this article was being written, and that's how I dated this article because it didn't have a date on it. He says that this week a new Kickstarter campaign was launched for Pebble Time. It was a new version of the Pebble watch, and that raised $17 million in only 11 days, which of course is just incredible. It's a huge amount of money, $17 million in 11 days, and then there are 19 days left as he was writing this. But if you go back and look at the Pebble Time was the one that collapsed the Pebble company. The Pebble Time never came into existence. You can read the final update on that Kickstarter campaign. I think it's called The Time of Our Lives or something like that. And that's basically when they say, we're throwing in the towel. The product, the Pebble Time is never going to happen. And I think they were bought out by another company for some of their tech or something like that. And then basically that was over. So, it is a critique of crowdfunding, and I want to talk about this more in other videos. It's definitely an important critique of crowdfunding to say, well, now wait a minute. If the Pebble watch overall couldn't be successful, even though it raised $10 million on the first round, and then $17 million, and then however much else on the second round for another product. If even it wasn't successful like that, then can anyone be successful? And of course, yes, people can be successful, because I've been successful with crowdfunding, and there are certain things you have to do, and a lot of other people I know have been. But it is legitimate to go, now wait a minute, these are the big numbers. These are the numbers that get people excited. These are the ones that Peter Diamandis is writing about here. And ultimately, they weren't able to do it. The coolest cooler, I think, there was a big debacle there. I'm not even sure, as I'm talking right here, whether or not they've delivered all of those to Kickstarter backers. They may not have. On the whole, though, it was not pretty. You can go back and look at all the updates and all the comments that people are talking about. So he says, even as powerful as that is, because those were all reward-based crowdfunding campaigns, even more important is the ability you now have to sell shares, equity, to your company, to the crowd, with something called equity-based crowdfunding. And so we're talking about equity-based crowdfunding. And if you're new, or even if you've been involved in crowdfunding as someone who has supported crowdfunding campaigns, you might not be familiar with equity crowdfunding, because it's not done nearly as commonly as something like a Kickstarter campaign. And that's actually because there are some rules about who can participate in equity crowdfunding campaigns. You have to be an accredited investor. That's actually the rule here, according to law, in order to participate in a equity crowdfunding campaign. And Peter Diamandis does lay that out here and says, in order to be an accredited investor, you must, generally speaking, have made over $200,000 a year for the last 2 years, or have $1 million in assets, not including your primary residence. I guess that's because the people who wrote the law thought that, well, if you've got all of that, then either you're good with money and you're going to be able to make good decisions as far as what campaigns you're joined as far as an equity crowdfunding campaign goes, or you've got so much money that it doesn't matter if you lose some. I don't know what their thinking was there, but they set that bar up for equity crowdfunding. And then there are other sites, like Kickstarter's a site for reward-based crowdfunding. There are other sites you can go to if you're interested in being a part of equity-based crowdfunding. So he says the opportunity for entrepreneurs and the 1-2 punch. Okay, so I'm just going to read this. It's very brief, and then I'm going to comment on it. So here's what Peter says. He says, if you're an entrepreneur, you should definitely experiment with both reward-based and equity-based crowdfunding as tools. This powerful combination allows you to first validate an idea and then raise the growth capital to implement it. Allow me to explain. As an example, look at Pono. Neil Young created a high-definition audio device called the Pono. They ran the Kickstarter campaign and pre-sold 15,000 units, raising $6.4 million in advanced market commitments. The Pono team next came to Crowdfunder to raise equity and allow their community also to become shareholders. Based upon the massive market interest, they raised $10.2 million in equity crowdfunding for Pono Music in 12 days. Now they are off to the races looking to disrupt the music device industry. Consider doing the same. Reward-based crowdfunding followed by an equity-based campaign that leverages the first campaign's momentum. This is not good advice, I think. Okay, let's start at the top. So it says, as an entrepreneur, you should definitely experiment with both reward-based and equity-based crowdfunding as goals. Don't try to experiment with equity-based crowdfunding anytime soon. If you're new to this, if you're new to bringing out products, if you're new to running a company, definitely experiment with the reward-based crowdfunding. Okay, because then you're producing something that you're going to try to get to people. If you start experimenting by selling your company, you may have problems down the road. Okay, this is why the equity-based crowdfunding is not something that I'm interested in. There are only 2 owners of Infinite Black, me and David LaRocca. We're both 50%. We're not interested in having other people be owners in the company, okay? Because then, of course, there are different rules that you'd set up, but then they're starting to expect things from the company. They're expecting returns. They may be expecting some kind of say in the way that things develop. when you're getting off the ground here and you're in the experimental stage about how am I going to develop products, how am I going to raise money, how am I going to do all this stuff with my company, don't start experimenting by selling your company. Now, I realize there may be some people who are like, I'm going to start 20 companies, and so if I start to experiment with selling some of this company, now, I'm going to be doing 20 others. That's not how most people work, however. They've got their company, which is going to be the engine for bringing out the products that they want to create. And so you may want to have complete control over your company and how it's run. And if you start selling the company, you won't have that, or you may not have that. And that's not something that I would recommend experimenting with lightly. Definitely stick with reward-based crowdfundings during most experimental stage, especially in the early days. This powerful combination, he writes, allows you to first validate an idea and then raise the growth capital to implement it. So I guess here, when he's talking about validating the idea, he's talking about the reward-based crowdfunding campaign being the validation of that idea, and then the growth capital coming in as a result of the equity crowdfunding campaign. And I don't recommend that either, because I recommend validating the idea before you ever launch the reward-based crowdfunding campaign, before you ever launch the Kickstarter or other platform. It's very important that you validate the product first, okay? So don't try to validate the product on Kickstarter. You want to do that before you launch the Kickstarter. Okay, now let's look at Pono, because this is another product that he uses an example here which doesn't have a really great history. Is anybody here watching who knows what the Pono is or has one? Maybe, but it won't be too many people, because it's another one of these situations where they raised a lot of money, but once again, raising a lot of money does not mean that your crowdfunding campaign is successful. So they raised a lot of money. It looks like 15,000 backers came out or something for the campaign. They raised $6.4 million. If you're not familiar with the Pono, you can look it up. You can look up the Pono crowdfunding campaign, Kickstarter campaign, and you can find out that basically, in a nutshell, the idea was that, well, all of the digital music players came around when storage space on a hard drive was very scarce. There weren't large hard drives, especially in portable players, and so there was this compression technology that would reduce the size of the song, or the file size of the song, down to something manageable. That way you could put a bunch of songs on your portable music player, but you're compromising the sound of the song and the integrity of the song. And the idea of the Pono when that ran was that, hey, why are we doing that anymore? Storage space is now cheap. You can put a ton of storage space even on a small device. So what we're going to do is we're going to say we can have very large file sizes for songs now, and be very large, and that way we don't have to compress it. We can get all of the nuance that the artist wanted in that song. We can capture it all with all this detail, not even worrying about the file size of that file, and then we'll put it all on these gigantic hard drives. And then the music's going to sound incredible. I mean, you're going to be experiencing music the way the artist intended for it to be experienced, because you're not having to go through compression technology in order to get the song on your device. And so obviously that idea sounds very good, and so that's why the crowdfunding campaign was very successful. And then they turned around and they did do this equity crowdfunding campaign and raised a bunch more money, And he says now they are off to the races and looking to disrupt the music device industry. Well, as I said, has anybody actually heard of that? Because I was looking up different reviews from people who actually got a Pono, and first of all, many of them were saying that it's difficult to use. So they didn't really understand how to use the Pono, like getting music on and off of it and stuff like that. I mean, they figured it out, but they said it's not particularly easy to do. And then also, once they got that, some people were running some tests, and they were like, nobody can tell the difference between the music that's on, the iPhone or whatever else device was around at that particular time, and the Pono. That people's ears weren't that good, apparently, that nobody could actually tell an appreciable difference, and so it just kind of went away. So I don't know what happened to those people who actually bought in for equity crowdfunding for the Pono. Now, I mean, I guess the people who backed the Kickstarter campaign did get Ponos, and then maybe they liked them, maybe they didn't, maybe they thought that, well, this isn't as good as I thought. But okay, that's one thing. But you get everybody the Pono as you promised. But then what do you do where all the people are like, now we're going to make all this money because the Pono is going to be the next big thing? I don't know. But I do know that if I were running that particular company and I got the Pono out and then it wasn't necessarily everything that everybody thought it was going to be, I wouldn't want to be responsible to a lot of people who had shares in my company, because I don't know where you go from there. At least if I got the Pono out and then it didn't do, people didn't like it the way that I was expecting them to like it, well, at least, the only people who own the company is me, or, me and one other person or something like that. And here's what also I know, as far as if somebody came to me and said, like Peter recommends here, consider doing the same. Reward-based crowdfunding followed by an equity-based crowdfunding that leverages the first campaign's momentum. I would say, whoa, slow down. That you're going to do a Kickstarter campaign, you're going to do some reward-based crowdfunding, and you're going to turn right around and you're going to sell a bunch of shares of your company through an equity crowdfunding campaign. First of all, have you ever created a product before? Have you ever done that? Have you ever done manufacturing? Have you ever done fulfillment? Have you ever gotten the product into distribution? Have you ever done any of that? And if the answer is no, then I think you don't have any business trying to go sell stock in your company, right? Because if this is the first time that you've done this, you're going to have a tremendous number of things that you've got to do. And so it's really a good idea to run a crowdfunding campaign that is small in the beginning, because you're going to learn so much from doing that. And that's basically what happened when we did War of Kings. We learned so much from doing that, because there are problems that go on every way. And every time you do a campaign, there are problems. But you get better and better and better. And sometimes you get problems because you get bigger and bigger. And so there are new problems that arise because of the volume that you're trying to deal with. But there are going to be a lot of problems that you're going to be contending with. And so it's okay if it's just you or just you and somebody else who's running the company. Because what happens if you get it out there and it's a success and, as far as making the product goes, but in the end, you did lose money? Well, that's okay. If it's just you and just you and another guy, you might decide, we lost money, but we gained a whole lot of experience. We learned so much, okay? We lost money, but now we've got all this knowledge and we're going to do it again. So you might decide, I don't care that we lost money. We're going to do it again. We're going to do it better. We got a new idea. We're coming out with this. Investors, if they own part of your company, may not be so happy if you lose money, or if you're unable to even complete the project. You are going to have a lot of people, if you do a big crowdfunding campaign, and then you are struggling trying to get the product produced for all the different reasons that could possibly happen. It's going to be very stressful. It's going to be very stressful. I mean, most Kickstarter campaign backers are extremely understanding of you keep them informed through updates about different things that are going on, different problems that you have. Some, of course, are not, and that causes a lot of stress. I can't imagine the stress that would occur if I were also trying to answer to investors. Like, I don't even want that on my plate. And probably you don't either. And like I said, if you're talking about this and I say, have you ever done anything to do with running a physical product or producing a physical product and getting it out? And you say no. Then the next thing would be, well, do you know anything about running a company at the level that could keep investors happy? And the answer is there, probably no as well. Both of those things probably have tremendous learning curves that you've got to go through. And doing one at a time is going to be fine. Like, if you want to sell the company later and do an equity crowdfunding later, then I say more power to you. But first, make sure that you have a very solid foundation on being able to create products, get the product out, get it to market, get it to your backers and all of your customers, and be able to get cash flow and all of these different things that go with running a company before you ever start thinking about, well, hey, I'm going to go sell this. That's my recommendation. So those are the kinds of things that I thought about going back and looking at this article that Peter wrote. And I do think it's really interesting, especially to look at in light of its time, because you'd have to evaluate these things in two different ways. First is looking at it from today, looking back, that's very important. That's basically what we're doing. But then also in the context of its time, what was going on? What were people thinking was going to happen? What were people thinking about? What were going to be amazing ways to use crowdfunding and this way to raise capital and all of this? And I think it does capture that. Of course, there's a whole lot of optimism. There's a tremendous amount of optimism in this blog post about, hey, you're going to have a great idea. You're going to raise a whole bunch of money on a crowdfunding campaign, a reward-based crowdfunding campaign, and then you're going to turn around the next month and you're going to raise millions more for your company, and then boom, it's all going to be, just money and everything else and success. But I'm telling you, don't count on it. There's a lot that crowdfunding has made easy, and we can talk about a bunch of those. But at the same time, there are still a lot of things that are very, very hard that crowdfunding hasn't made any easier, that you still have to deal with. Those are the human elements, that's the manufacturing elements, that's the logistical elements. All of that hasn't gotten any easier because of crowdfunding. You still have to go through all that, so you have to know how to do all of them. So anyway, I guess I'm going to wrap up here, but that's my take here. If you found this article or something like that and you're looking at, well, I'm thinking about running crowdfunding for my business and possibly doing this kind of 1-2 punch here, my recommendation would be to slow down, to really get to experiment through the reward-based crowdfunding. Start small and then start. That way you have all of the basics right and then grow from there. All right, I'll see you in another video.